She came back to herself in the dark, being dragged. That was the first thing. Not pain, not confusion, not the cold that pressed through the fabric of her uniform against the concrete floor. Just the dragging. The scrape of her heels. The damp smear of something she didn't want to name, left behind her in the corridor. Her arms pinned behind her back, fingers locked in a grip that wasn't human in its geometry, in the number of joints that bent the wrong way around her wrists. She didn't remember her name. She knew other things. She knew the hum of ventilation in the walls at two distinct pitches, meant two separate systems. One military spec, one something else. Something newer and colder, something that had been installed recently, beaming. Enough that the concrete around its housing hadn't fully cured. Challenge, she knew that the corridor behind her sloped a 1/4 degree downward, which meant she was being taken toward a lower level. And she knew this not because she was estimating, but because her body had a memory her mind didn't. Because some part of her had mapped this angle before, had walked it in the other direction. She knew the grip around her wrists was not tight, because it needed to be, because whatever held her simply hadn't considered whether she would struggle. It had not occurred to it, in whatever calculus governed its behavior, that the thing it was dragging was something other than cargo. That was the first mistake. She drove her heel into the floor, found purchase in the crack between two concrete sections, jackknifed her body sideways, and came around with her elbow in a single fast arc. She felt the impact at the thing's temple, or what passed for a temple, a raised node of tissue beneath bandaging so old it had calcified to a second skin, the cloth gone gray and stiff and fused to whatever was underneath like a plaster cast applied in another decade, and the grip dropped. She hit the floor from her hands, felt the sharp sting of concrete against the heel of her palm, and was up before the thing had finished falling. It lay on its side in the corridor, bandaged face, gray fatigues that might once have been NATO olive but had been steeped in something for so long. Color had given up, had become a gray that was not a color so much as an absence of the previous color. It made a sound, a low click, repeated 3 times, like a telegraph key operated by something that had learned language the way a child learns a song. The rhythm and the pattern, without the understanding, without the meaning behind the symbols, without any of the ordinary human architecture that makes language more than noise. She found a fist-sized chunk of concrete where the wall had shed near a junction box. She went back and used it. The clicking stopped. She stood there afterward with the concrete in her hand, and her chest moving, and looked at what she'd done. Not the moral accounting of it, that could come later, would announce itself without invitation, at whatever hour was least convenient. Just the practical inventory. The thing was still, was going to stay still. She could move. She looked at her hands, blood on the right one, hers, from the floor. She pressed it against her thigh and held it there until the sting centered her, until the pain gave her something local and specific to be present with. Then she looked at the ID clipped to her left breast pocket. Francis, Canteen Services, cleared, level 2. She looked at it for a long time. The card was worn at the edges, the laminate starting to lift at the top right corner. The small photograph of a face she had to take on faith was her own, slightly underexposed. The laminate smelled of coffee and something floral, a hand lotion or a soap. Something personal that clung to the card the way personal things cling to objects that live close to the body. Then she said the name out loud, quietly, just to hear how it sat in her mouth. Francis. It fit the same way the uniform fit, correctly but without memory. Like she'd been wearing it for someone else. Or like the name had been handed to her, across a gap she couldn't see across. She pocketed the concrete chunk. It wasn't much of a weapon, it was what she had. The corridor stretched in both directions. No windows. They were underground. She understood that without knowing how she understood it. The same way she understood the ventilation pitch, and the floor gradient, and the layout of the junction box housing. She'd found the concrete near. Fluorescent strips overhead, half of them dark, the rest cycling between white and a faint amber she didn't trust, that amber light which was not the amber of a room with a warm bulb or a late afternoon window, but the amber of something generating heat from a process she didn't have a name for. The air tasted of copper and something botanical, not plants, nothing living, but the ghost of a chemical that had wanted to be organic, and hadn't quite made it, that had been designed in a laboratory rather than grown in a field, and carried that quality of incompleteness, being almost but not entirely what it was imitating. She'd smelled something like it once. She didn't know when or where. It was there, the way a tooth is there after the nerves have been removed, the shape present, the pain absent, the full experience denied. She went left, because left had a slight draft, and drafts meant ventilation connections, and ventilation connections meant exits or occupied rooms. And she preferred either of those options to the alternative. His name was Briggs, or that was what the stencil on his jacket said, done in black paint in the military block style of a man who had been assigned to a system that stenciled its people the way it stenciled its equipment, for inventory purposes, against the possibility of loss. He'd barricaded himself behind an overturned equipment trolley in what had once been a records room, judging by the filing cabinets and the wall-mounted pegboard with its hooks, still holding maintenance clipboards nobody would ever clip again. He'd used the trolley's steel frame as the spine of his barricade and wedged the filing cabinets on either side to create a V-shaped, defensive pocket he could hold from one direction, with his back against the wall and a clear line of sight to the only entrance. She found him in the third corridor junction. He had a fire axe. He swung it at her before she cleared the doorframe. She dropped below the arc, felt the displaced air move across the top of her head in a clean line, came up inside his reach and put her forearm across his windpipe. Not hard. Just pressed than a statement, a pressure that said, consider. He went still. His eyes were extraordinary. The specific shade of pale green that some people had who'd grown up near the sea, wide now with the whites showing around the iris like a startled animal's. And behind the white, something that was not just fear but also the specific exhaustion of someone who had been operating at maximum fear for an extended period and whose fear response had been wrung out enough that it was producing information rather than just alarm. He was maybe 22. He smelled of fear sweet and hydraulic fluid and the particular cold smell of a room that had been shut up with too few people breathing in it. "I'm not one of them," she said. "I can see that." His voice came out compressed under her arm. She stepped back. He lowered the axe slowly. The way you lower something you've been holding so long it's acquired mass beyond its own weight. His hands were shaking, she noticed. Not from fear. Or not only from fear. From the sustained tension of having held a weapon ready for what must have been hours. The memory of a stance, maintained past the point where maintaining it was comfortable. "How long have you been in here?" she asked. "Don't know." The clock stopped. He looked at his wrist, where a watch face showed 3:47 with no conviction whatsoever, the second hand motionless, arrested at the exact instant it had decided the situation was no longer its problem. Came on shift at 0600. The alarm about an hour in. Maybe longer. What alarm? He stared at her. The containment breach, level 7. The whole facility on lockdown and sealed the blast doors. And then, he stopped. Swallowed. Tried again. Then they came through the blast doors. The ones that were supposed to keep things in. Francis looked at the filing cabinets. At the dark smears on the underside of the trolley that told her. Something had been on this side of his barricade not long ago, and had been persuaded to leave. At the way he held the axe thumb-tucked, grip high on the handle, slightly forward of the standard two-handed position. Like someone who had been shown once, in a different context, how to hold a tool like this, and had been working from that single demonstration ever since and improving on it by necessity. "You've been fighting them alone," she said. "I'm a supply clerk." He said it without self-pity, just taxonomy. "This is the category I belong to. This is what that category has been doing. What's your clearance?" "Level 2, apparently." He gave her a look of complete bewilderment that contained, somewhere in its edges, the beginning of something else. The recalibration that happens when the evidence stops fitting the category. A level 2 canteen staffer should not have been able to move the way she'd moved in the doorway. He filed this away and said nothing about it, which she noted as evidence of intelligence. "What's on level 7?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Outside in the corridor, somewhere at the far end. The east end, she thought. though she didn't know how she was orienting herself underground without windows. Something. The three-beat telegraph pattern, then it receded. They called it the aperture, he said finally. I know that much. I shouldn't know that much. The scientists on sub-level 3 used to come up for meals. And they talked among themselves when they thought nobody was listening, when they thought the canteen staff wasn't there. He glanced at her badge again. No offense. None taken. They said they'd found a resonance. Something in the electromagnetic signatures from the Soviet test sites. Not the bomb detonations themselves. The other signal, the frequency, that came after each blast that wasn't electromagnetic. That shouldn't have existed at all. Their instruments kept recording for 18 hours after every detonation, even when all the other readings had flatlined. He had the look of a man's reciting something memorized from the words of someone else, passing it on the way a courier passes a message. Accurate but without full comprehension, carrier who doesn't know the full contents of what he's carrying. They thought it was a door. Was it? It was a door, he said. They opened it. Bachman found them 20 minutes later. Or rather, they found him. When they heard the sound of something heavy being dragged around a corner, and came around the corner to find him hauling the prone body of a creature twice his size by one ankle, face red with effort, jaw set, breathing through his nose, in the way that people breathe when the alternative is to make noise they can't afford. He stopped when he saw them. He looked at the creature. He looked at them. It's not dead, he said, just stunned. I need to get it into the storage unit before it wakes up. Francis considered this. Why? Because it was conscious for about 15 seconds after I hit it, and in those 15 seconds it was oriented toward a particular vent shaft in the east wall. Moving toward it the way water moves toward a drain. Not looking for it. Not navigating toward it. Just going toward it. The way something goes toward a thing it recognizes as destination. I want to know where that shaft leads before I decide what to do with the information. She looked at him more carefully. He was older than Briggs, mid-30s, close-cropped hair, with the gray coming in at the temples, the careful economy of movement that suggested either military training long since applied to a civilian life, or the physical intelligence that some people develop independently through decades of working with their hands. His jacket said Boffman, Technical Services. His knuckles were split in a pattern that told her this wasn't the first one he'd stunned today, and that the stunning had been done efficiently and without drama. Smart, she said. Terrifying is what it is. He looked at her badge again, at Canteen Services, and had the grace to say nothing about it, to take it as information without editorializing. There's a woman on level 4. Government, I think. Some ministry that doesn't have a public name. She's been in the monitoring station since the breach, and she knows what happened. I've been trying to get to her for 3 hours. What's in the way? Everything. He said this without particular drama, the way a tradesman describes a blocked pipe. Here is the condition of things. Here is what it requires. They took the creature to the storage unit, chill room once used for specimen refrigeration, still running on the emergency power that the facility had apparently prioritized for climate, controlled rooms and the lower-level systems. Whatever those lower-level systems were, the creature woke up twice during the journey, and Bachman dealt with it both times with the calm of a man who has made peace with the immediate necessity of thing and stored the moral accounting of it in a compartment he can access later when it won't get anyone killed. In the chill room they secured it with cable ties from the supply rack and stood back and looked at it for a while. It was bandaged from jaw to hairline. The old bandaging, the cloth gone gray and fused in places where fluids had dried and re-dried and dried again. Over what might have been weeks or might have been longer. Might have been a duration that didn't map onto the week-based calendar cleanly, where the bandaging gaped near the throat. Francis could see tissue that was trying to do two things at once, maintain its structural integrity, and reorganize itself according to a different set of priorities, the cellular equivalent of a building being renovated from the inside while the facade is kept standing. The mouth, when it moved, clicked, 3-beat rhythm, then 4. Then 3 again. The signal repeating with the patience of something that expected an answer eventually. Signaling, Francis said. I thought so, too. Bachman crouched down to its approximate eye level. The eyes were gone. Or rather, the eyes were sealed. The lids grown together in a smooth, continuous membrane, as if the default state of a face was a closed door and these eyes had simply reverted to default. It navigated by something else. He'd watched it navigate at pace through a corridor in complete darkness and had not been able to determine what sense it was using. The older ones move differently, he said quietly. Like they've had more time. More time inside the arrangement. Arrangement, Briggs said. That's the best word I have for it. They're not dead. They're not the same as they were. They're something that was human and has been arranged into something that serves a different purpose. He stood up. This one is still recent. The arrangement isn't finished. Frances went to the vent shaft in the corner of the room. She opened the grating and put her hand inside. The draft was stronger here, and the copper botanical smell with it intensified. And below the smell, something that was not a smell at all but a physical quality of the air, a subsonic vibration that wasn't quite sound, that she felt in her molars and the base of her skull, the way you feel a turbine running in the wrong frequency for its housing. Not painful, not pleasant, insistent, a presence rather than a sensation. This is the way, she said. The shaft descended through the body of the facility in a series of linked horizontal and vertical sections, some of them wide enough to crawl through on hands and knees, with the elbows finding reasonable purchase, some of them requiring the held breath and the careful placement of limbs, and the kind of trust in the geometry of your own body that you don't know. You have until the geometry is the only tool available. Bachman went first with a penlight clamped between his teeth, the beam pointing forward, his shoulders just clearing the sides of the tighter junctions. Frances went last. Body remembered the geometry of confined spaces without being asked, the exhale before the tight section. The head turned left at the junction, not right. The push from the balls of the feet rather than the toes for efficiency and silence. She noticed this the way she'd been noticing everything since she'd woken up in the corridor. The inventorying of competencies, whose origin she didn't account for, the catalog of things she could do that she had no memory of learning. The vibration grew stronger as they descended. By the time they reached the horizontal section that ran parallel to level 4, the vibration had moved from the teeth and the skull base into the chest cavity, resonating in the sternum with a frequency that felt like a very large emotion trying to find its proper expression in a too small body. Level 4 was lit differently from the upper corridors, not fluorescence but something warm and amber. Not the false amber of the upper levels with its cycling and its wrongness, but something that was trying to be firelight and almost succeeding, the color of late evening in a room with west-facing windows at the end of October, the light that makes everything look like it's just before something important. Frances came out of the shaft into a monitoring station and stood up and looked at the light and felt something tight in her chest that had nothing to do with the crawling. That was not relief exactly, but was adjacent to it, that recognized something in the room without being able to name what. The room looked like a room where people had worked, past tense, the tense of interruption rather than conclusion. The clipboards still hung on their hooks. The coffee mugs were still on the desk, some of them half full, the coffee inside them having completed its room temperature journey from beverage to artifact, from the thing people drink to the thing that marks where people sat. One mug had a lipstick print on the rim, the transfer perfect, the impression of lips caught mid-sentence. Or mid-pause, mid-thought. The moment before the alarm had sounded, and the sentence had never been finished. The large wall chart, a grid of measurements in columns so fine they required the standing lamp beside it to be legible, the lamp still on, burning faithfully in an empty room, was covered in annotations in 4 different handwriting styles. The last annotation had been made in red grease pencil, at a steep angle, that suggested either urgency or the hand of someone who hadn't slept in long, enough that the body's self-governance was starting to slip. The suited woman was standing at the window. The window looked down through reinforced glass into a chamber below that Frances had no reference point for in terms of scale. It was large, larger than should have been geometrically possible given the levels she'd moved through to arrive here, as if the space inside it was operating on different terms than the space outside. The ceiling of the chamber was lost in the amber haze that seemed to be generating itself, rather than being generated, creating its own source, the light of a process rather than a lamp. In the center, where the floor curved slightly downward to a central point the way a basin curves, something existed that Francis's eyes could register but not settle on. Not a light source, not a physical object, a density. Place in the air where the normal transparency of space been interrupted by something that was using that location as a passage. A seam, a crease, a place where two surfaces had been pressed together in a way that created an opening between them, and through that opening something was coming, patiently, steadily, the way a tide comes in, unhurried by the concept of opposition. The aperture, Francis said. We opened it in September of 1951, the suited woman said without turning from the window. Voice was calibrated to the professional temperature of a person whose job it was to deliver information that could not be softened by delivery. Kind, not kind, designed to be received rather than felt. The theoretical framework was sound. The experimental methodology was sound. The safety protocols were. She stopped. Let it settle insufficient. Where does it lead? We don't know. We have never known. The working assumption was that it opened into a proximate dimension, some adjacent fold of space-time that our physical laws governed, that we could study and quantify, and eventually exploit in the way we'd planned to exploit the atom. She turned finally, and Francis saw the exhaustion in her face. Not sleeplessness, but the exhaustion that comes from being right about something terrible and having been overruled, from having written the memorandum and been thanked for the concern, and been told that the protocols were adequate, and having watched the protocols prove themselves inadequate. What we actually did, she said, was create an invitation. The resonance was not a barrier to cross. It was a signal, and something received it. Can it be closed? Hoffman said from across the room. He'd gone directly to the secondary console when they'd entered. Had been reading the displays with the attention of a man who has no theoretical background but a very good practical eye for what systems are doing as opposed to what they're supposed to be doing. Yes. The suited woman looked at him with an expression that acknowledged yes as a word with conditions attached to it. There is a resonance chamber on sublevel 6. The aperture was opened by a specific electromagnetic pulse sequence derived from the Soviet signatures, a frequency our equipment was designed to replicate and amplify. In theory, running the inverse sequence at full amplitude from the resonance chamber will close the aperture the way a key closes a lock. She looked at the window again. At the chamber below. The resonance chamber must be operated manually. The remote systems on the upper levels were the first things the incursion disrupted. Every engineer who attempted to reach sublevel 6 after the breach. She did not complete the sentence. The sentence completed itself in the silence. Someone has to go down, Francis said. Yes. Someone with access to the resonance chamber controls. The suited woman looked at her. It was a particular kind of looking. The assessment of someone who has been waiting for a specific piece of information and has just received it in an unexpected form. You don't know who you are, she said. Again, not a question. Francis said nothing. Your name is Francis. You were the technical specialist assigned to the resonance chamber on a rotating basis. The equipment down there required human supervision because the automation kept producing drift errors that nobody could trace to the hardware. You were good at it. You were better than good at it. She spoke steadily and without decoration, as if the facts themselves were what mattered, and the selection of them was a form of care. You volunteered for the sublevel rotation repeatedly. The other technicians found the isolation difficult. You didn't seem to mind it. She paused. When the breach occurred, the senior engineering staff made for the resonance chamber immediately. They did not arrive. You were the last confirmed presence on sublevel 6. When communications went dark, we assumed you were dead, Francis said. Yes. Francis looked at the window, at the chamber below, at the seam in the center of it pulsing with its amber patience. I'm not dead, she said. No. The suited woman looked at her with something that was not quite wonder but lived in the same neighborhood. Quiet recognition of a fact that resists its own implications. You are very much not. Sublevel 6 lived below the facility the way basements live below houses. structurally necessary, practically real, preferring not to be examined closely. The descent took them through 2 levels of increasing strangeness. Corridors where the mold was. The walls had taken on a faint organic quality, a surface sheen that was not moisture, but something that had been breathed onto the concrete from the wrong direction, for long enough to change its texture. Light had stopped cycling between white and amber, and had committed to an amber that deepened as they went lower, as if the light were being produced by the thing below, rather than by the strip fixtures in the ceiling. And the creatures. More of them, on these levels. Moving in patterns, not random wandering, not the aimless patrol of something without purpose, something that suggested a distributed intelligence, a coordination achieved without visible communication. The way birds flock without a leader, the way a school of fish turns before the first fish has turned. Francis navigated around them rather than through them, finding the pauses in their patterns, pressing flat into alcoves with the others. While the clicking passed so close, she could hear the individual beats of it separate and recombine. Briggs was extraordinary at this. She noticed it early and said nothing, simply watched. The way he'd already plotted the rhythm before she'd consciously registered it herself. The way he went still with the completeness of a person whose stillness was a choice, rather than a default. The way he read the spatial geometry of each junction and alcove before he needed to use it. He would not be a supply clerk at the end of this. She didn't know what he would be. That was for him to figure out in the time after, if there was a time after. He would not be what he'd been before. The suited woman came with them, without being asked and without asking anything in return. She moved through corridors in expensive shoes, over wet concrete with the unseeing practical efficiency of someone who had already paid all available attention to things that couldn't be outrun, and had decided that comfort was not a relevant currency for this particular journey. Composure was remarkable. Francis had a feeling she'd assembled it, piece by piece. Over the course of years in rooms where composure was the expected uniform, and the failure to maintain it was the failure that people remembered. She wore it the way people wear armor they've stopped noticing, automatically, without being conscious of its weight. Boffman moved on the flanks, quiet and effective, the decisions that had to be made, resolved without drama. When a creature at the junction to sub-level 5 came from an angle they hadn't anticipated, moving faster than the ones above, the arrangement further along, the new geography of its anatomy more efficiently oriented toward the task it had been given. He interposed himself. It and Briggs, without any apparent deliberation, just moved into the space the threat was moving toward. Because that was the space that needed occupying, he dealt with it. He kept moving. He said nothing about it. Francis filed it alongside everything else she was learning about what people are. In the dark, the performance of what they're supposed to be has been stripped away by necessity, and what's left is just the fact of them. The door to sub-level 6 was sealed. Military-grade blast door, set a frame that had been over-engineered the way everything connected to this level had been over-engineered, designed by people who understood that the things you build to contain what you're most afraid of need to be built for fear rather than the expectation. It had been sealed from the inside. Francis stood in front of the keypad. She looked at her hands. Then she put her right hand to the keys and the sequence came out of her fingers, the way music comes out of a musician who hasn't played in years, halting at first, the first notes coming with a searching quality, then gathering, the body remembering what the mind was still reaching for, the motor pattern asserting itself against the amnesia the way something essential asserts itself against loss. The door opened. The sound it made, the seal breaking, the pressure equalizing, the mechanical declutching of the locking mechanism, was the most ordinary sound she heard since she'd woken in the corridor. Industrial and purposeful and human, the sound of a machine doing what it was built to do. She went in. The resonance chamber was the most beautiful room she'd ever been in, or the most terrible, both simultaneously in the way that only a very few rooms manage to be. The rooms that matter too much to be only one thing. It was circular, the walls lined floor to ceiling with equipment in a continuous ring. Instruments and consoles and coil housings, and the cable infrastructure of something that had been designed to interact with physics, at a level below the visible, all of it oriented inward, toward the central platform where the primary coils stood dormant in their housing. The ceiling was high and domed and showed the underside of a structure that had been built with the patience of something intended to last past the moment of its necessity. The amber vibration was very strong here, pressing against the eardrum steadily, pressing against the chest, not painful but insistent, the way a very important person's presence fills a room before they speak. On the platform in the center, the logbook sat open on the operator's stand. She crossed to it. She already knew whose handwriting it would be. Her own. Of course it was her own. She stood over it and read words she didn't remember writing. In a hand she recognized the way you recognize a piece of music from the first two notes, and the reading of them was a slow retrieval rather than a discovery. The last entry was dated 6 weeks ago. The handwriting on that entry was different from the handwriting on the earlier entries. Not messier, exactly, but more economical, stripped of the small stylistic flourishes that handwriting carries when the hand that makes it has the luxury of time. The writing of a person who has accepted that there is one more thing to do and is doing it. The last line read, "If this works, nobody will know it needed doing. If it doesn't, someone will have to try again." Briggs had come to stand beside her. He read the line too. He looked at her. "That's you," he said. "Yes." He didn't say anything else. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people standing on the same ground, in the same difficulty, with no ambiguity between them about which side of things they were on. "The control sequence," she said. "The inverse pulse protocol." The suited woman had already crossed to the secondary console on the north arc of the wall. She'd identified it without being told, had moved to it with the directness of someone who has read a map and memorized it, and can now navigate by the memory. She brought up the display. Cathode tube screens in green, the technology of a world that had been confident in its own methods, that had built its instruments in the idiom of competence and moderate ambition. She called up a file. The mathematics on the screen were several dozen pages deep. Frances looked at the mathematics and understood it, not because she was reading it for the first time, because she'd written half of it. The other half was someone else's work. She could see the scene between the two contributions, the way a musician can hear the moment where one performer hands off to another, the slight shift in emphasis, the different relationship to the underlying structure. 4 minutes to full amplitude, the suited woman said. Approximately. The coils will need the first 90 seconds to reach resonance, and from there the build is not linear. There will be a threshold moment. At around 3 minutes, when the aperture will register the inverse signal and begin to resist it. She looked at the door. At that point, everything on this level will know what's happening. "How many?" Baughman asked. "All of them," she said simply. Briggs made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and would never be mistaken for one. He turned it into something else. He looked around the chamber, at the single sealed door, at the equipment ring with its narrow service passages between the console sections, at the 4 of them in the amber light of a room that had been built for exactly this purpose, by people who had hoped it would never need to be used. He looked at the axe in his hands. He repositioned his grip, thumb tucked high on the handle. "All right then," he said. It was, Francis thought, exactly the right thing to say, and said in precisely the right way. Not performance, not false comfort, not a speech. Just the words a person uses when they've looked at the full extent of what's in front of them and decide that the extent of it doesn't get to determine whether they show up for it. The decision already made. The showing up the only remaining variable. She sat down at the primary console. The sequence had not changed. It lived in her fingers the way everything she needed lived in her fingers, the body having carried forward what the memory had dropped during whatever had happened to her in the hours between her last logbook entry and the she'd woken up, being dragged down the corridor. She ran through the pre-initiation checks with the focused speed of something done so many times that the speed is no longer the result of rushing but of efficiency. Every unnecessary motion stripped away, task reduced to the things it actually requires and nothing else. Behind her, she heard the suited woman take position at the door. She heard Boffman move to the secondary entrance, a ventilation access panel that Frances had not yet looked at, but whose existence she'd noted when she'd scanned the room, filed under things that would matter later. "How long?" the suited woman asked. 3 minutes 50 to full amplitude. Call it 30 seconds more for the aperture to respond. They'll be here before 3 minutes. Yes. She heard the suited woman settle her weight and understood that this was the extent of the planning. There was no further strategy available. There was the door and the time and the people standing between the two. She began the initiation sequence. Coils started their primary oscillation cycle, a bass note that came up through the floor and into the soles of her feet, and moved up through the bones of her legs and the base of her spine, the frequency of a very large machine, beginning to understand its purpose. The amber deepened in response, brightened, the haze taking on the quality of intention. The door moved. It moved the way a dam moves before it fails. Not a single impact, but a distributed pressure building across the full surface. The door frame creaking at the corners as something on the other side applied itself with the patience of something that had never needed to hurry, that had no concept of a thing not eventually yielding, that had been on the other side of barriers for long enough to have internalized the certainty of eventual passage. Then the pressure became impacts. Then the clicking began, not one voice, not three, not a dozen, but a tessellated wave of it. The 3-beat pattern multiplied and overlapping, until it became a continuous sound, a kind of percussion that carried information Frances could feel but not decode, that had a grammar she couldn't read. Boffman hit the door with the flat of the axe head, not cutting into it, using the axe as a brace, a point of counterpressure, his whole body behind the handle, the geometry of leverage against force, the equation a man can set up with what he has and hold for as long as he can hold it. 60%. Primary coils screaming at the edge of their housing tolerance. The ventilation panel came open. Frances did not turn around. She heard the impact of the panel giving way, and she heard Briggs. The brief, sharp contact of close quarters, the sound of effort, and of something that didn't sound like either of them hitting the floor and staying there. Then silence from that direction, and then Briggs's breathing, and then his boots on the concrete as he repositioned himself in front of the open panel. She did not turn around. The vibration had moved from physical sensation into something else, something that operated below the register of sensation, that was changing the quality of the air in the chamber, the way a very strong magnet changes the quality of the air around it, making it feel oriented, directional, as if the air itself were beginning to understand which way was important. The door came open. Not all the way. Boffman had its measure, was working it, managing the opening the way you manage a controlled burn, giving ground by increments that were his to give, the aperture at the hinged side, wide enough to be a problem. The problem being handled. A creature came through the gap, and the suited woman dealt with it, with something from the secondary console that Frances chose not to look at. Another came through and Bachman hit it on the descent and it went down. They were not elegant, they were sufficient. There is a specific human tradition of sufficient, of the thing that works without being beautiful, that holds without being designed to hold, that gets the job done with what's available and asks no credit for the grace it doesn't have. It is. Frances thought, in the last part of her, that was still running parallel commentary, one of the most characteristic things about her species, the sufficiency achieved through stubbornness rather than design. 90%. In the aperture chamber above them, something changed. She felt it through the floor before she heard it in the instruments. A shift in the vibration's character, a change from the opening quality, the invitation quality, to something that was the same frequency heard in opposition. The same note pressed in the other direction. The door feeling the key turning in it and recognizing the turning. The amber deepened to red at the edges. 95%. The door came fully open. Boffman took the impact across his shoulder and went to one knee, and she heard him hit the floor, and she heard him come back up. The impact of his boots as he found his footing, and she heard him hit the thing, and she heard it go into the wall equipment, and she did not turn around. She was looking at the display, at the numbers climbing, at the reading that told her where they were relative to where they needed to be and the distance between those 2 points closing in fractions, in tenths, in hundredths. She thought briefly about the logbook, about the version of herself that had sat at this console 6 weeks ago and tried this same thing and failed, and had written the last line of the last entry and done something. She still didn't know what, that had resulted in the state of waking up with no memory in a corridor. Whatever that had been, whatever protection it had conferred, whatever it had cost, she thought about Briggs, a supply clerk, with sea-green eyes and shaking hands who had turned out to be someone completely different from a supply clerk with sea-green eyes and shaking hands without any of the intermediate steps that usually produce that kind of transformation. She thought about Bachman behind her, and the sound of his boots, and the way he'd placed himself in the path of the thing at the level 5 junction, without calculation, without announcement, as if the placing of the body into the space that needed occupying was simply the obvious next action. 100%. She hit the initiation. The inverse pulse came out of the coils in a wave. Not a sound, something below and behind sound, the vibration of something enormous and structural being reversed, being run backward. The frequency of a door not opening but closing, not accepting but refusing, the fundamental resonance of a thing that was supposed to be sealed. Being sealed again. Passed through her body the way tidal forces pass through stone. Not experiencing the stone as significant, finding the path through it regardless. Above them, through the concrete and the wrong air and the amber haze, the aperture received it. 4 seconds it resisted. 4 seconds during which the chamber tried to shake itself apart, the coils running beyond their specified limits. The readings going into columns on the display that had been labeled but had been assumed to be theoretical rather than operational, the air pressure dropping and then spiking in the sound. If it was a sound, what she heard in those 4 seconds qualified as sound, rather than as the physical impression that very large things leave on very small sensory apparatus. The sound of a boundary between things that should be separated being restored, being enforced, being made real again by the application of a force sufficient to insist upon it. Then it stopped. The silence afterward was total, the deepest sense she'd heard since the corridor, since the dark. The silence of something that had been generating continuous sound for 6 weeks suddenly stopped. The amber left the air. It left like weather leaving, not an event but a state change, a gradual withdrawal. The room returning to the quality of a room rather than a space with a presence in it. The fluorescents overhead flickered, and some of them came back on. The ordinary white of ordinary electric light, the light of a room where people work. And Frances sat at the primary console and looked at the display showing the aperture at 0 amplitude and let herself breathe. They came out through a surface access in the east wing as the morning was beginning to consider itself. A maintenance hatch that opened onto a hillside above the facility. Above the perimeter fence, above the vehicles on the approach road that had been there since before the breach, and would presumably still be there when the people who drove them came back to ask what had happened to the rest of the day. The morning was gray and cold and wet. The specific English wet that is not rain, but the accumulated moisture of a sky that has decided rain is more trouble than it's worth, and will instead simply be present, will distribute itself on every available surface and into every available breath, until the air itself is more water than air, and the distinction becomes academic. The grass underfoot was heavy with dew, and the smell of it. Living, vegetable, completely ordinary, the smell of ground that grows things without any special reason to, and does it anyway, hit Frances like something she'd been told about but never experienced, like the smell of a country she'd read about, but only just arrived in. She stood at the top of the hatch and looked at the trees on the far ridge and the gray sky above them, and breathed. Came out behind her and did not look at the trees or the sky. He looked at his hands. The shaking had stopped. He turned them front and back with the attention of a man checking an inventory he's been maintaining without full confidence in its accuracy. Satisfied, apparently, with what he found, he put them in his jacket pockets and looked at the trees. Bachman came out last. He set the axe against the facility wall, head down, handle up, with the care of a man leaving something he's done with for someone who might still need it. The suited woman was on the field radio. Her voice was the same here as it had been at every other depth. Calibrated, professional, giving nothing away that she hadn't decided to give, which was how she was able to give so much of what she was deciding to give. She was describing the situation to someone who had questions she wasn't answering yet, giving them instead the outline, the shape of what had happened, the part she'd decided they could process in this phone call, as opposed to the part that would require the next several phone calls. She was very good at it. Frances had a feeling she had always been very good at it, and that this was one of the things about her that had made her hard to be near and essential to have around. Frances sat down on the hillside. The grass was cold and wet, and she sat in it and looked at the ground and let it be what it was. The memory was there. She could feel the edges of it, the parts that had come back during the pulse, the parts that had been there all along in the fingers and the body's knowledge, and the competencies that had persisted past the other erasure, not complete. A room that had been reorganized by someone who didn't know where things went and had put them in the available spaces rather than the right ones. She'd spend time with it. She'd find the wrongly placed things and move them. The name of the town she'd grown up in came back while she was looking at the dew on the grass. It came the way things that have been lost come back when you stop looking for them directly. Between one moment and the next, occupying the space it had always occupied, as if the space had never been empty, as if it had simply been waiting for her to be still enough. She said it out loud, quietly, just the name of a town, spoken to the gray morning and the wet grass and nobody in particular. Briggs looked at her. She shook her head, not refusal, just a signal that the thing didn't need explaining, that the explaining could come later and would come easier then. He nodded and looked back at the trees. Hoffman sat down 3 feet away and said nothing, which was what the moment required and what he was good at. Below them, somewhere in the facility, something settled. A deep structural sound, tectonic, the sound of a building returning to its own geometry after having been asked to be something else for an extended period, the sound of weight redistributing to where weight belongs. The amber was gone from the air entirely. Frances could tell, because the gray morning light had become specific and local, the light that belonged to this hill and this sky and this country on this morning, rather than the secondary light of something bleeding through, from somewhere, it hadn't originated. The suited woman finished her call. She lowered the radio and stood for a moment looking south, toward where the road disappeared behind the tree line, and her composure did a very small thing that Frances didn't observe directly. Then she turned. "There will be a debrief," she said, "a significant one, with significant documentation. There will be a period of time during which this doesn't officially exist, followed by a longer period during which it will continue to not officially exist in a more formalized sense." She looked at the 3 of them with the directness of a person accustomed to delivering information that doesn't improve through softening. "None of you will be formally thanked." "I know," Briggs said. Bachman said nothing. The nothing meant the same thing. Frances looked at the gray sky above the ridge. There were birds up there, small ones, moving in the specific chaotic pattern that birds move in when conditions are benign and they have nowhere particular to be, when flight is for its own sake rather than for destination. She watched them for a while. She thought about the aperture below them, sealed, and whether sealed was permanent, or whether it was one of those words that carried conditions she couldn't currently read. She thought about the Soviet signatures that had provided the original frequency, which meant someone on the other side of a border was running. Instruments that were recording the same resonance, which meant she hadn't closed a door so much as closed one access point to a door, and that the door itself was still out there in whatever configuration doors like this existed in. She thought about the logbook entry. If this works, nobody will know. She looked at her hands. "I need a cup of tea," Briggs said. The absolute sincerity of it, the complete, specific, culturally particular commitment to this statement as a response to everything they had just been through. Precise selection of this one ordinary human need as the thing to name first, in the gray morning on the wet hillside above the sealed facility, was, Frances thought, one of the most human things she'd ever heard. Choosing of the small specific comfort over the vast summary, The refusal to be summarizable. She laughed. It surprised her. Short and involuntary and genuine. The laugh of a person ambushed by something delightful in the ruins of something that had been anything but. It sat for a moment on the hillside, and then the morning absorbed it, and it was part of the morning. She stood up. She brushed the dew off her palms on her thighs. She looked at the road curving away south, and the gray sky, and the birds up there moving for the sake of moving. "There's a pub 3 miles that way," the suited woman said. She looked at her watch. A good one, wound by hand, the kind that keeps its own counsel. "It opens at 7. It is currently 7:12. They went down the hill. None of them looked back at the facility. This was not because they believed it was over. Francis was certain none of them believed that, and the suited woman's carefully maintained composures suggested she believed it least of all. It was because there is a specific human act that has no equivalent in any other architecture of intelligence Francis had ever theorized or encountered. The act of placing the next step forward rather than looking back at the last one. Not ignorance of what's behind. Full knowledge of it, carried, weighed, accepted. And the forward step taken anyway, because forward is the only direction that opens. The dew soaked through her shoes before they reached the road. The grass smell was enormous around them. Somewhere in the little distance, a bird was making a noise like minor complaint. They walked south in the gray English morning, the 4 of them, carrying what they were carrying in the way that people carry things they will eventually set down. Not now, not here, not yet, but sometime, in a room with better light, when they've found the words for it. The aperture was closed. She remembered her name. That was enough, for now. That was everything, for now.